I still remember the sound my truck made when I shifted into low gear at the top of that ridge, because about 5 seconds later I hit the brake so hard I thought I'd blown the transmission. For a second, I honestly wondered if I'd taken the wrong road home, because the limestone quarry I'd spent 12 years building with my own hands was simply gone. Not collapsed, not flooded, not damaged. Gone. Buried beneath what looked like half the construction waste in western Tennessee. My name is Grant Mercer. I'm 56 years old, and I've been in the blasting and aggregate business longer than some of my employees have been alive. My father taught me this trade when I was barely old enough to hold a shovel, and my grandfather before him made a living pulling stone out of these hills long before fancy subdivisions started appearing every few miles. When people drive past a quarry, they usually see an ugly hole in the ground. I see mortgage payments, payroll checks, families feeding their kids, and generations of hard work carved one controlled blast at a time. That quarry wasn't just dirt and rock. It was my life's work. I had spent 12 years carefully exposing a rare layer of deep blue limestone that contractors all over the Southeast paid premium prices for because it was stronger, cleaner, and almost impossible to find anymore. Every blast had been permitted, every truckload documented, every inch inspected by the state. I wasn't running some backyard operation. I operated one of the cleanest licensed mining sites in the region, and I took pride in that. I had just returned from a 5-week drilling contract in Kentucky, one that was supposed to give my regular crew enough work to carry us comfortably into winter. The whole drive home I kept thinking about finally getting back to normal, sleeping in my own bed, grilling steaks with my wife Carol, maybe taking my grandson fishing that weekend. Instead, I climbed out of my truck and just stood there in complete silence. Fresh red clay stretched across the entire quarry floor, broken concrete, asphalt chunks, tree stumps, twisted rebar, rotten lumber, old pipe, even pieces of torn-up sidewalks. It looked less like a quarry and more like somebody had emptied an entire county landfill into it. My foreman, Eddie, came running over before I even made it halfway down the access road. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask about Kentucky. He just shook his head and quietly said, "Boss." I didn't know what else to do. His voice cracked more than I'd ever heard in 23 years of working together. Eddie wasn't the kind of man who got emotional. I'd seen him stay calm after blasting accidents, equipment fires, and tornado warnings. Seeing him standing there looking defeated scared me more than the mess itself. We spent the next 2 hours walking across that mountain of debris, and every step made my stomach sink a little lower. Fresh tire tracks, heavy dump truck ruts, compacted fill. Whoever did this hadn't snuck in overnight with a couple pickup trucks. This had taken weeks, maybe longer, and dozens of commercial dump trucks. Somebody had organized this. Somebody had paid for this. Somebody had wanted my quarry buried. The first thing I did was call the county landfill office. I've dealt with enough inspectors over the years to know paperwork usually tells the truth long before people do. At first, the woman on the phone hesitated, but once I explained I owned the property, she started reading shipment records. 48 commercial dump loads, same billing account, same destination notes. One customer, Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I actually asked her to repeat it because I thought I'd misheard. A homeowners association? Dumping thousands of tons of construction fill into a licensed quarry? That didn't even make sense. I thanked her, hung up, sat in my truck for about 10 minutes staring through the windshield, then finally called the number listed for the HOA president. A man answered after 3 rings. "This is Daniel Prescott." Calm voice, confident, like he'd been expecting calls all day. "Daniel," I said, trying harder than he probably realized to keep my voice steady. "My name is Grant Mercer. I own the Mercer Blue Rock Quarry directly behind Cedar Ridge Estates. I think there's been some kind of mistake." He actually chuckled. "No mistake." I frowned. "Excuse me. Your pit was becoming a hazard," he replied casually. "Kids were getting curious. Homeowners were complaining. Property values were taking a hit every time somebody looked over the ridge and saw that giant hole. We solved the problem." I looked back at my quarry, then back toward the subdivision sitting peacefully on the hill beyond the tree line. "You filled my commercial mining site with construction waste. We improved the neighborhood." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Daniel, that's private property. Private property doesn't give you the right to endanger an entire community." I laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because my brain refused to accept another human being could actually believe what he was saying. "You realize that Quarry is fully licensed by the state?" He answered without missing a beat. Permits don't impress homeowners." Then he added the sentence I'd remember for the rest of my life. "Honestly, you should be thanking us. We probably saved you the cost of filling it yourself someday." Before I could even respond, he kept talking. "Actually, our board calculated about $35,000 in fill expenses. Since we improved your property, we'll expect reimbursement. Our environmental consultant also recommends additional stabilization work, so you'll be responsible for that as well." I just sat there holding the phone away from my ear for a second, wondering if this was some elaborate prank. Then I quietly asked, "You're sending me the bill for burying my own quarry?" "That's correct," he replied. "Good afternoon, Mr. Mercer." Click. The line went dead. I stared at the phone for several seconds before slipping it back into my pocket. Eddie walked over and asked what happened. I looked across the mountain of dirt covering 12 years of my life and said something I'd never imagined saying out loud. "Whoever this man is, he has absolutely no idea what he just buried." The next morning, I didn't wake up angry. I woke up focused. And after 30 years in the blasting business, I'd learned something most people never do. Emotions make expensive mistakes while paperwork quietly wins wars. Eddie was already waiting at the office with coffee and a stack of invoices spread across my conference table. Neither one of us talked much at first. We just started adding numbers. 3 active contracts, 1 highway expansion outside Nashville, 1 courthouse restoration using architectural blue limestone, and another for a luxury resort that specifically requested stone for my quarry because they wanted the natural blue color that couldn't be duplicated anywhere else nearby. Every single one of those projects depended on material that was now buried beneath thousands of tons of junk. Before lunch, my phone had already rung 6 times. The first contractor was patient. The second sounded nervous. By the third call, lawyers were being mentioned. Nobody cared why I couldn't deliver. They had deadlines, penalties, and investors breathing down their necks. I couldn't even blame them because I'd probably react the same way if I were sitting in their shoes. By the end of that day, my accountant estimated we were bleeding tens of thousands of dollars every 24 hours the quarry stayed shut down. Meanwhile, Daniel Prescott apparently decided ruining my business wasn't enough. 2 days later, a county inspector showed up carrying a complaint claiming I was operating an unsafe and possibly illegal excavation that threatened nearby residents. The inspector, a younger guy named Michael, climbed into my truck and looked around for almost an hour before finally taking off his hard hat and sighing. "Mr. Mercer," he said quietly, "I honestly don't know why I'm here. Everything I can see is fully compliant, except someone filled your quarry." We both laughed, though neither of us found it particularly funny. Before leaving, he leaned against his SUV and said something that stuck with me. "Whoever filed this complaint doesn't understand mining law." At the time, I didn't either, at least not nearly as well as I was about to. That evening, Carol found me sitting alone in my office long after dark. She didn't ask questions. She simply placed a plate of reheated pot roast beside me and kissed the top of my head. "We've been married 32 years, and she knows what I'm thinking." "You're looking for something," she finally said. I nodded toward an old steel filing cabinet tucked into the corner. "My grandfather never threw anything away." She smiled. "Neither do you." She was right. My family kept records that went back generations. Old surveys, deeds, lease agreements, geological reports, maps drawn by hand before interstate highways even existed. Around 9 o'clock, I unlocked a cabinet I hadn't opened in years. Dust covered everything inside. There were rolled blueprints tied with faded string, leather folders, brittle tax documents, and one thick envelope marked Mineral Estate Transfer, 1969. I carefully unfolded the documents and felt my heartbeat slow down. There it was, in black and white, recorded with the county decades before Cedar Ridge Estates had even been an idea. My grandfather hadn't merely purchased land. He had purchased the mineral estate beneath that land, granting exclusive extraction rights extending hundreds of feet below the surface and protecting those rights against interference by neighboring property owners. I must have read the same paragraph 15 times. Every time it sounded stronger. Every time it sounded more expensive for somebody else. The following morning, I drove 2 hours to meet Richard Holloway, an attorney who specialized almost exclusively in mining and mineral rights. He looked like the kind of lawyer who spent more weekends fishing than arguing in court. But once he finished reading my documents, he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and asked one simple question. "Grant, did they knowingly dump that material into an active licensed quarry? 48 truckloads. Do you have records, county landfill receipts, photos, hundreds, operating permits, Every renewal for the last 12 years. He slowly smiled. Then I think Mr. Prescott just bought himself the most expensive landscaping project in Tennessee. Even I laughed at that. Richard explained something I'd honestly never paid much attention to, because I'd never needed to. Surface ownership and mineral ownership are not always the same thing, and in my case, both belonged to me. More importantly, state law protected licensed mineral extraction from unauthorized interference. Daniel thought he had covered an ugly hole. Legally speaking, he'd interfered with a protected commercial mining operation. Those are two very different conversations once judges become involved. We didn't waste another day. Richard filed emergency complaints with the State Division of Mineral Resources, attached every permit, every shipment record, every aerial photograph, and every survey we could gather. I figured it might take months before anyone looked at it. I was wrong. 4 days later, my phone rang before 8 in the morning. Mr. Mercer, this is Inspector Laura Benton with the State Division. We'll be on your property tomorrow morning. They arrived in 3 white trucks carrying survey equipment, drilling rigs, and enough paperwork to fill a small library. Inspector Benton introduced herself with a firm handshake and immediately walked toward the quarry without wasting time on small talk. Behind her came 2 surveyors, a geologist and another inspector carrying sealed sample containers. About 30 minutes later, Daniel Prescott came racing down the access road in a black SUV, followed by 2 HOA board members wearing matching polo shirts with the neighborhood logo stitched on the chest. Daniel climbed out, already talking loudly. This inspection is completely unnecessary. We've improved a dangerous eyesore. Inspector Benton didn't even look up from her clipboard. Sir, unless you're the licensed operator of this quarry, I'd appreciate you remaining outside the marked survey area. His face turned red almost instantly. I'm president of Cedar Ridge Estates, she calmly answered. Congratulations. Eddie had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing. Daniel pointed toward the massive pile of dirt, restabilized hazardous land that was lowering property values. Inspector Benton finally looked directly at him. Did your association obtain written authorization from the mineral rights owner? Silence. Did you receive approval from the state? More silence. Did you conduct contamination testing before placing construction debris over an active extraction layer? Daniel shifted his weight. Our environmental consultant. That's not what I asked. For the next several hours, the inspectors drilled core samples through the fill material. Every few feet they stopped, photographed the layers, sealed evidence bags, and logged GPS coordinates. I watched quietly from beside my truck while Daniel became increasingly agitated, pacing back and forth and making phone calls every few minutes. Around lunchtime, the geologist climbed back out of one of the boreholes carrying a sample tube streaked with blue limestone, mixed with red clay, crushed asphalt, and concrete dust. He handed it directly to Inspector Benton without saying a word. She examined it for maybe 10 seconds before turning toward me. Mr. Mercer, she said, I'm afraid this isn't good news. My stomach tightened. How bad? She looked back at the contaminated sample. The exposed limestone has been compromised. Even if we remove every load of fill, much of this material may no longer meet commercial specifications. I closed my eyes for a second. 12 years of careful excavation, destroyed by people who thought they were making the neighborhood prettier. Daniel overheard every word. He walked over smiling nervously and tried changing his tone completely. Now hold on. Surely we're talking about a misunderstanding here. Richard, my attorney, had just arrived and stepped beside me. No, he answered calmly. We're talking about damages. For the first time since this nightmare began, I watched confidence disappear from Daniel Prescott's face. Richard never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He simply looked at Daniel, then at the inspectors standing around the contaminated core samples, and quietly said, from this point forward, every word you speak can become part of the record, so I'd choose them carefully. It was amazing how quickly confidence can disappear when reality finally catches up. 2 weeks earlier, Daniel had been billing me for burying my own quarry. Now, he couldn't even decide where to put his hands. He tried one last time to frame the whole thing as a community improvement project, talking about children, safety, property values, and neighborhood concerns. But Inspector Benton cut through the speech with the kind of calm authority that only comes from someone who's been doing a job for decades. She explained that none of those concerns gave a homeowners association the legal right to interfere with a licensed commercial mining operation, especially one protected by recorded mineral rights. Before leaving that afternoon, she issued a formal state order requiring Cedar Ridge Estates to remove every cubic yard of unauthorized fill under state supervision while preserving evidence for the civil case that was already taking shape. Watching those papers being handed to Daniel felt strangely empty. I expected satisfaction. Instead, I mostly felt tired. The next month became a blur of depositions, engineering reports, financial audits, and courtroom meetings. My accounting team documented every delayed shipment, every canceled delivery, every hour heavy equipment sat idle, every employee we kept on payroll even though they couldn't work because I wasn't about to punish good people for someone else's arrogance. Independent geologists calculated the value of the contaminated blue limestone, contractors testified about missed deadlines, and economists projected future losses caused by interrupting long-term supply contracts. The numbers kept growing until they almost stopped sounding real. Richard warned me not to celebrate anything until the judge signed an order, because lawsuits have a funny way of humbling people who think they're already winning. He was right. Daniel's attorneys tried every argument imaginable. They claimed the quarry looked abandoned because I'd been away on another project. They argued the fill actually improved my property. They even suggested I should be grateful because the material could someday be reused. The judge listened patiently through all of it before asking one simple question that seemed to suck the air out of the courtroom. Did anyone representing Cedar Ridge Estates ask the property owner for permission before depositing thousands of tons of material? Nobody answered because nobody could. After nearly 6 weeks of hearings, reports and testimony, the ruling finally arrived. The court awarded compensation for the destroyed limestone, lost business revenue, excavation expenses, equipment downtime, and environmental remediation, then applied enhanced damages after finding the interference had been intentional rather than accidental. When Richard slid the judgment across the conference table toward me, I looked at the final number 3 different times before it actually registered. Just over $6 million. I leaned back in my chair and laughed once, not because I was happy about the money, but because I remembered Daniel telling me I owed him for improving my property. That sentence had cost his association more than anyone in that neighborhood could have imagined. The insurance carrier refused coverage almost immediately, pointing to clear exclusions involving commercial mining operations and intentional property interference. Within weeks, Cedar Ridge Estates announced emergency assessments that many homeowners simply couldn't afford. Board members resigned, one after another. Lawsuits started flying between neighbors, former directors, and management companies, each blaming someone else for approving the dumping operation. Daniel filed personal bankruptcy before the association itself dissolved. I drove past the subdivision one afternoon months later and hardly recognized it. The entrance sign was faded. Landscaping hadn't been maintained. Several homes had for sale signs sitting in front yards that looked neglected. It wasn't the victory I pictured while this whole mess was unfolding. Most of those families had never dumped a single truckload into my quarry. They simply trusted the wrong people to make decisions on their behalf. And in the end, they paid for someone else's ego. 11 weeks after the state crews began removing the debris, the last load finally rolled away. I'll never forget standing on that overlook at sunrise with Eddie beside me as the first clean layer of blue limestone appeared again beneath the morning light. He looked over at me, smiled, and said, "Looks like she's been waiting on us." I nodded because I honestly couldn't think of anything better to say. A few months later, the quarry was running at full capacity again. The delayed contracts were completed. New customers signed on after hearing what had happened, and business eventually became stronger than it had been before anyone from Cedar Ridge ever decided they knew what was best for land that wasn't theirs. Every now and then, when we set off a controlled blast and I hear the echo roll across those hills, I wonder if anyone in that old subdivision still remembers the day they decided to solve a problem that wasn't theirs to solve. Maybe they do. Maybe they don't. What I do know is this: property rights only matter when people are willing to defend them. And sometimes the most expensive mistake a person can make is believing confidence is a substitute for the law. So now I'd like to hear from you. If an HOA decided your property was an eyesore and took matters into their own hands without permission, would you have handled it the same way I did? Or would you have chosen a different path? Let me know down in the comments, because these stories always spark great conversations. And if you've ever lived through an HOA nightmare yourself, I'd really like to hear what happened. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.